Hello, Biology 202 students. Welcome to your online lecture. Before we dive into this week's lecture on the respiratory system, I have a fun little challenge for you. I want everyone to hold their breath for as long as they want or can. Ready, set, go! As you're holding your breath, let me introduce you to today's lecture. We will be learning about the respiratory system. If you're still holding your breath, congratulations. It's been 12 seconds. If you want to try for the current world record, it would take another 24 minutes and several more seconds. I wouldn't hold my breath that long if I were you. I also can't. Moving on, Ibn al-Nafis is credited with first describing the pulmonary circulation. This is the link between the heart and the lungs, which we mentioned briefly in previous lectures. This week, we'll focus on the gas exchange between the air we breathe and our blood. We'll also talk about the structures of the respiratory system as well. We've already learned about the heart's role in moving blood and the pathways it takes. Now we're going to delve into the structures that are key in oxygenating our red blood cells and the other functions of the respiratory system. For today's agenda, we will go over the respiratory system and its functions. First, we'll start off with the gross anatomy, and then we'll follow up with the detailed anatomy and physiology. After which, we'll talk about the mechanisms of breathing, get into some clinical applications, and talk about some diagnostic tools. So, what are the functions of the respiratory system? Well, the first and most obvious is gas exchange. The respiratory system facilitates the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between the air we breathe and the bloodstream. This process is essential for providing oxygen to our body's tissues and removing carbon dioxide, a waste product from cellular metabolism. Additionally, the respiratory system plays a role in regulating the blood pH, protecting against inhaled pathogens and irritants, enabling vocalization by providing airflow through the vocal cords, and facilitating olfaction, or the sense of smell. The olfactory receptors located in the nasal cavity detect airborne chemicals, allowing us to perceive different odors. So without further ado, let's dive into that anatomy and physiology. The upper respiratory tract is a complex and crucial part of our respiratory system, consisting of both external and internal structures that work together to facilitate breathing, protect against pathogens, and aid in olfaction and speech. Externally, air enters through the nostrils, or external nares, which lead into the nasal cavity. Internally, the nasal cavity is divided left and right by the nasal septum, and it's all lined with mucous membranes and tiny hairs called cilia, which help filter the air, and the mucous membranes help humidify the air. Within the nasal cavity, the nasal conchae, or turbinates, are curved bones that increase the surface area, further aiding in warming, humidifying, and filtering the incoming air. Additionally, those nasal conchae create turbulent flow, which enhances the detection of odors by the olfactory epithelium located on the roof of the nasal cavity up here. That turbulent flow also enhances the humidifying and warming effect that is needed to help protect our respiratory passages. The pharynx, or throat, serves as a passageway for both air and food and plays a vital role in speech. The soft palate and uvula, right here and here, close off the nasopharynx during swallowing to prevent food from entering that airway. So up here is the nasopharynx, because this is the part of the throat that attaches to the nose or nasal cavity. And then down here is the oral pharynx, and this is close to the mouth, so it's the part of the throat close to the mouth. Here we have our external features of our mouth. We have our lips, our teeth, our tongue, our hard and soft palate here, and then there's the uvula that hangs right here. And the uvula has a strong sensory feedback where if anything really touches it, it will initiate the gag reflex. So down here is the larynx, or voice box, located below the pharynx. It houses the vocal cords, which vibrate to produce sound as air passes through them. The respiratory system's mucous membrane, cilia, and immune cells all collectively work to protect the body from inhaled pathogens and particulates, ensuring that air reaches the lungs is clean and warm and humidified. The lower respiratory tract is all of this. We get the trachea down to the diaphragm. So the trachea is a tube that is supported by C-shaped rings of cartilage that help keep that airway open. This is the tube we always want open because if it closes, we can't breathe. Now that trachea bifurcates into the right and left primary bronchi. And that's because we have two sets of lungs, right? We have our left and right side. And our right side actually has three separate lobes, a superior and an inferior, and in the middle, what would you guess the name to be? Well, it is the middle lobe. And on the left side, we only have two lobes. You can see the indent there, and there's a superior and inferior on that side. So for each one of those lobes, there is another split. So we had our right and left primary bronchi. Well, those split into our secondary bronchi, one for each lobe. And then they branch out even smaller into tertiary bronchi, and finally into tiny tubes called bronchioles. Bronchioles don't have cartilage. Instead, they have smooth muscle and elastic fibers, which allows them to change size to control airflow. The bronchioles lead to small air sacs called alveoli, which look like clusters of grapes. The alveoli have thin walls that let oxygen and carbon dioxide move quickly between the air and the blood in nearby capillaries. This is important for getting oxygen into the blood and removing carbon dioxide from the body. Each lung is covered by a double-layered membrane called the pleura. The outer layer, the parietal pleura, lines the chest cavity, while the inner layer, the visceral pleura, covers the lungs. And between those layers is the pleural cavity, which contains fluid to reduce friction and help keep the lungs inflated. So just like the heart, we have a pleural cavity that cushions our lungs as they move when you inhale and exhale. And down here you can see the diaphragm. The diaphragm is the muscle that increases and decreases the volume in your chest cavity, which will cause air to move into your lungs and out of your lungs. Your whole lower respiratory tract is actually lined with mucous membranes and ciliated columnar cells, which trap and move particles out of the airway. And fun fact, the more you smoke cigarettes, those cilia actually get slowly destroyed. So you lose the ability to move foreign particles out of that lower respiratory tract. The larynx, commonly known as the voice box, is a central structure that allows us to speak, breathe, and prevent food and water from entering the airway. Let's explore its key components. So first we have the epiglottis up here, and it is green. The epiglottis is like a guard at the entrance of the airway. Its main job is to direct food into the esophagus and protect the airway simultaneously. When you swallow, the epiglottis snaps shut to ensure that food, water, and saliva go down the digestive tract and not into the trachea. After swallowing, it reopens to allow breathing. You can test this by trying to breathe and swallow at the same time. It's nearly impossible because the epiglottis is doing its job. Next, we have the thyroid cartilage here in orange, and the thyroid cartilage is where your thyroid gland is located. It also forms the prominent Adam's apple visible on the neck. Next is the arytenoid cartilage and corniculate cartilages. These cartilages are essential for voice production. So the vocal cords attach to the arytenoid cartilage, which move to adjust the tension and position of the vocal cords, helping us produce sound. The cricoid cartilage forms the base of the larynx and provides support. In extreme emergencies, a procedure called a cricothoracotomy may be performed here to open the airway if it is blocked. This involves making an incision in the cricoid cartilage. However, this procedure is only done by medical professionals with the proper knowledge and tools, as it's not commonly used in emergency rooms today due to the availability of more advanced equipment. So here is a cross-section of the trachea, and it shows several distinct layers. The inner lumen is this big hole, this is the airway, and then along the inner lining here is the mucosa. The mucosa is lined with pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium containing goblet cells that produce mucus. So those cilia on those cells also, they make a waving pattern so that you're constantly getting rid of any contaminants that made its way into that lumen, like pollen or dust. Beneath the mucosa is the submucosa, which contains seromucous glands that also contribute to the mucus layer. The next layer is the hyaline cartilage. This forms C-shaped rings that provide structural support and keep the trachea open. We always want to breathe, so we always want this open. The open part of the cartilage rings here faces the esophagus, and it is connected by the trachealis muscle here. This allows for flexibility and contraction during coughing. So your trachea actually changes the inner diameter by contracting that trachealis muscle to help get rid of foreign contaminants. Finally, we have the outermost layer. It is called the adventitia, and it's a connective layer that anchors the trachea to surrounding tissues. As we transition lower down the respiratory tract, we move closer to where a gas exchange occurs. After discussing the trachea, we can now consider the primary bronchi. The primary bronchi are the left and right ones here, and they split at this point called the carina. Then our primary bronchi split further into the secondary bronchi and further into the tertiary bronchi. Together, these structures form the conduction zone, which includes all airways that transport air from the external environment to the site of gas exchange. The conduction zone encompasses the trachea, bronchi, and bronchioles. The bronchioles lead to the alveolar ducts and eventually to the alveoli, which are tiny air sacs where gas exchange occurs. The walls of the alveoli are extremely thin and are surrounded by capillaries, facilitating the passage of oxygen from the alveoli into the blood and the movement of carbon dioxide from the blood into the alveoli to be exhaled. This regulation of carbon dioxide is crucial because it significantly impacts blood pH. Carbon dioxide, a byproduct of metabolism, combines with water to form carbonic acid. Slow breathing can lead to a buildup of carbon dioxide, which results in respiratory acidosis, where the blood becomes more acidic. Conversely, rapid breathing expels more carbon dioxide, potentially causing respiratory alkalosis, where the blood becomes more basic. Thus, the respiratory system plays a vital role in maintaining the acid-base balance of the blood. So remember when you were trying to hold your breath on the very first slide, and then you started to get that feeling that you need to breathe? Well, that's actually because of a change in the pH. You have chemoreceptors in your medulla oblongata of your brain that sense a change of pH in your blood. And so when you hold your breath, the pH is going down and it's becoming more acidic from that carbon dioxide. So that is why you feel the need to breathe, not because of the lack of oxygen, but because of the buildup of CO2. So, in summary, we have our conduction zone, which includes structures that transport air. This includes our trachea, our bronchi, and our bronchioles. Then we have our respiratory zone, which includes structures involved in gas exchange. That's our respiratory bronchioles, our alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and alveoli. We'll learn more about each one of those in the next slide where we cover the histology. So in respiration, the air moves from the primary bronchi to the secondary bronchi to the tertiary bronchi, and then further into smaller bronchi until finally the small bronchi subdivide into bronchioles, which are less than 1 millimeter in diameter and lack cartilage. The bronchioles continue to branch and eventually lead to terminal bronchioles, marking the end of the conducting zone. From the terminal bronchioles, the pathway enters into the respiratory zone. So right here we have that conducting zone transitioning into the respiratory zone. Now we have the respiratory bronchioles through here, which have occasional alveoli budding from their walls. These respiratory bronchioles then lead into the alveolar ducts here and into alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs contain clusters of alveoli, and that is where the gas exchange occurs. So you can see all of those in this image, and on the image, it's a different section. So it's a cross section where you see the lumen of the whole bronchiole. And then over here, you can see those same alveoli and alveolar sacs here. Now let's get into the respiratory muscles. The diaphragm is the primary muscle involved in breathing. During inspiration, it contracts and moves downward, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity and reducing pressure, which allows air to flow into the lungs. The intercostal muscles located between the ribs also play a key role. The external intercostal muscles contract to lift the rib cage upwards and outwards, further increasing the thoracic volume. When someone is having a hard time breathing, accessory muscles are recruited to assist with the effort. These include the sternocleidomastoid and scalene muscles in the neck, which help lift the rib cage, and pectoralis minor in the chest, which aids in expanding the thoracic cavity. The use of these muscles indicates increased respiratory effort and is often seen in conditions like asthma or COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So the first thing to know is the diaphragm is the main muscle for breathing, and when it contracts, it pulls air into the lungs by increasing the volume in the thoracic cavity. So more volume and less pressure. Then when you exhale, that diaphragm relaxes and decreases the volume in the thoracic cavity, which creates positive pressure. And higher pressure in the thoracic cavity than the atmospheric pressure will cause the air to move out of your nose or mouth. So this is spirometry. Spirometry measures different lung volumes and capacities to assess how well your lungs function. There are a few words here and a few wiggles on the graph. The graph is showing volume over time. So we have volume on the y-axis and time over the x-axis. And so first, if you were just to sit where you are and we measured your breathing for a few minutes or seconds, we'd get these first little wiggles. These show your tidal volume. This is your average resting change in volume in your lungs. And then if you were to try and get a huge breath on top of one of those, you would get your inspiratory reserve volume. And if you were to expire or breathe out as far as you could, that would give you your expiratory reserve volume. Now, really, you have to subtract your tidal volume from those. So you have your top range of your tidal volume here, and then your top range of your inspiratory reserve volume. And that would be your inspiratory reserve volume. And then if you take your lowest amount on your tidal volume, like here, and you measure the difference between that and the lowest part in your expiratory reserve volume, a big exhale as far as you can exhale, that would be your expiratory reserve volume. If you added all of those, so your expiratory, your tidal, and your inspiratory volumes, that will give you your vital capacity. Vital, it's important for life. So if you're going to rest and exercise, you're going to use your total vital capacity here. The last one, or there's two more here. We have our residual volume, which is something you can't really exhale. This has to be in your lungs at all times. And your total lung capacity. And that's the total volume of everything in your lungs, from the most empty it goes to the most full it goes. Now, there are some resources you can calculate your own total lung capacity, and residual volume, but you're actually going to do that in class. Understanding these is very important, and it's critical in helping diagnose and monitoring respiratory conditions. So just looking at this graph, it might be a little confusing at first, but just know that the tidal volume, kind of like the tidal waves, are always coming in and out when you're breathing. And these reserve volumes are the range of usable volume that you can consciously use. You're breathing all the way in and all the way out here. And if you combine these, you get different volumes. So your normal breathing, tidal volume, and your breathing plus the full range of your breathing is the vital capacity. And that plus your residual volume, the amount that you cannot exhale, because if you were to do that, you'd probably collapse a lung, that's your total lung capacity. So this is spirometry. There will be a lab activity with this, and it should be rather engaging. All right, so let's break it down all together now. So during inspiration, air enters the body through the nares or nostrils and passes through the nasal conchae, which warm and humidify the air. The air then moves to the nasopharynx, the upper part of the throat, behind the nose, followed by the oropharynx, the middle part of the throat behind the mouth, and then the laryngeal pharynx, the lower part of the throat. From there, the air passes through the larynx, the voice box, where the vocal cords are located, and travel down the trachea, or windpipe. At the bottom of the trachea is the carina. This is where the trachea splits into the left and right primary bronchi, each leading to a lung. Within each lung, the primary bronchi branch into secondary bronchi, which further divide into smaller tertiary bronchi. These tertiary bronchi continue to branch into even smaller bronchioles, which lead into respiratory bronchioles. The respiratory bronchioles can lead to the alveolar ducts, which can open into alveolar sacs. The alveolar sacs contain tiny air sacs called alveoli, where gas exchange occurs. Now, the whole expiratory situation is very similar, but here the diaphragm relaxes, decreasing the volume in the thorax and increasing the pressure, which forces air out of the lungs. So now you will understand how respiration happens. Let's dive into some of the pathology, and then I'll let you carry on with your day. So we'll start with asthma. Asthma is a chronic respiratory condition characterized by inflammation and narrowing of the airways, which can lead to difficulty breathing, wheezing, and coughing. It can be triggered by allergens, exercise, cold air, and stress. Management often involves inhalers containing bronchodilators and corticosteroids to reduce inflammation and open the airway. Emphysema is a type of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, that involves damage to the alveoli. This is a histology image here. You can see that the air sacs in the lungs look a little deflated and loose. This damage reduces the surface area for gas exchange, leading to shortness of breath and difficulty in breathing out. Smoking is the primary cause, and treatment focuses on quitting smoking, medication, and oxygen therapy. So let's focus on COPD. This is a group of progressive lung diseases, including emphysema and chronic bronchitis. It is characterized by obstructed airflow, making it hard to breathe. Symptoms include chronic cough, mucus production, and shortness of breath. Smoking is a leading cause, and management includes medications, pulmonary rehabilitation, and lifestyle changes. Now, recent studies have shown that not only smoking, but also vaping can contribute to these diseases. So be careful when introducing foreign particles into your lungs, as your lungs are very sensitive and are easily damaged. Our last pathology that we'll talk about is anthracosis. Anthracosis, also known as black lung disease, is caused by the inhalation of coal dust over long periods, leading to accumulation of carbon in the lungs. It results in chronic cough and lung tissue damage. Prevention involves minimizing exposure to coal dust, while treatment focuses on managing symptoms and preventing further lung damage. So if you do ever end up working in a coal mine, please wear your respirator. Everybody likes to breathe, and it is torturous when you have some of these diseases that make it hard to breathe. Thanks for sticking around for the respiratory lecture. I hope your day is phenomenal, but make sure you check your syllabus and any activities that might be coming up for this lab. See you in class.